Hello and welcome to another episode of the Renewable Energy Movement podcast powered by Kibio. Today we have Bernd Kipping. Bernd is the Vice President Finance, Procurement, Innovations and Technologies for Chint Solar Europe and has been with them for the majority of their growth into what they are today. How was the pronunciation of the name to start with, Bernd? Perfect, I'll take that. It's always difficult in different languages. Bernd, thanks very much for being here. Tell us a little bit about your initial journey into the renewable energy space.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. Yeah, my background actually is finance. So I studied finance and then was working in M&A environment around the financial crisis, which was a very hard time for that industry. And this was around 2007, 2008 when solar was booming. And I got the opportunity then back in the days to join Qcells, which was the world leading cell manufacturer back in the days. It's nowadays very difficult to imagine that we had solar cell production even in Europe. So I was joining the company basically beginning 2009 as a sales controller. Qcells was really big at the time. I mean, had a market capitalization of 6 billion euro, was one of those large companies in Germany. And I was there working in the so-called Solar Valley, which is when you still go from Berlin to Munich by car, you pass by, you still see the exit Solar Valley. And as a sales controller there, I just joined when basically the market was turning from a seller's to a buyer's market, meaning sales has to completely restructure their approach to work with customers. And yeah, that was the time I got into the industry, basically at the turning point.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, it was quite hard to believe today that there was such a large producer of cells in Europe.
It's not only cells, actually. In the Solar Valley, there were also production of different thin film technologies. It's a bit like called Solar Valley because of Silicon Valley, because it was the idea of growing a huge industry really upstream within Europe. So this was basically all happening around the 2000s with, of course, huge support of the German government favoring solar, but also other European governments. But unfortunately, industry turned. And when I joined, as you could already see, coming up from China, where then, of course, cell prices dropped and the business model was getting in danger, let's say, at least from upstream point of view.
Yeah, okay. And then when you then moved to, I think it was Con Energy, were you at that point sold on the renewable space? And were you looking for another role in a similar area? Or?
Yeah, actually my role was similar at Con Energy, and the company were comparable at that point in time. Also, Con Energy had a quite strong manufacturing footprint, actually not only solar modules and cells, but especially also mounting systems, inverters. So it was a much more integrated company in that regards, and was also downstream much further active. Also, having a very strong distribution business back in the days with wholesalers, but also own PV projects, and is very well spread across Europe in different countries. So my role then when I joined Con Energy was more being responsible for the whole purchasing of components, not only cells and modules, but everything, and basically the supply chain allocation of goods. But still, company was quite stressed from a financial point of view. If you remember back, Qcells went insolvent in 2012, then Con Energy went insolvent in 2013. And that was the period I was within those companies. I mean, it was certainly not the environment which was boring. It was quite challenging, especially in supply chain, where it's a clear focus on having really low working capital, quick turnaround times, serving the customers who are there with good quality on time. So it was stressful, but excellent learning as well. But company situations were similar.
Yeah, interesting. Obviously took that experience from Qcells with you to Con Energy. Well, what about the actual market in that time then? You mentioned how the market looked when you started with Qcells back in 2009. What shifts did you notice in the market through your time at Con Energy?
Well, the thing is, the market downstream was not necessarily bad. I mean, there were still projects to be built and the market was constantly growing. But the products we are having were not just competitive, right? Because the company were completely relying on manufacturing. So all the downstream companies were still operating well and doing good business, but all those upstream integrated companies having cell manufacturing, module manufacturing, they were sitting on assets, production lines, which were not state of the art. I mean, nowadays we see what China is capable in doing in terms of manufacturing, but this started back in those days with growing factories quickly, different competitors coming up. Even in China, you see that always the tier one, the leading manufacturer was dead the year after, right? There was a severe competition amongst the global suppliers, but especially for German manufacturing companies, this was very difficult. And this was basically the difficult part of those two companies. Nevertheless, the market still was there, was growing. I mean, we had quite good projects in Germany back in the days and other European countries. But this was the difficulty of those companies until insolvency. And then basically at Conergy, we did a restart in 2013 with an adjusted business model, completely focusing on downstream business, right? Not anymore doing production, but just downstream business, which worked well for quite some years, especially in the UK. Then 2015 was a super attractive ROC scheme in place where significantly projects were deployed, but also in other countries, of course.
It's quite an interesting viewpoint because every country has slightly different ups and downs in renewables. That can be affected by what tariffs are offered at that time, or even what political regimes are in place. Especially, if you were covering a European-wide role, I think you then went on to be director of global risk management. You must have had quite some exposure to that.
True. I mean, this was how the role was also created, right? So within the new start at Conergy, I was still doing supply chain, but then stepped into the role of the global risk management because of overseeing our investment decisions and coordinating investment committees, but also standardizing project assessment criteria for investments globally. And I mean, we were active in 14 countries across Europe, but also, let's say, Mexico and the Philippines and other regions. And of course, you cannot easily compare projects by IRR only. It's a lot about the risk profile, about feed-in tariffs, about the law in place, about regulations on permitting side. So it was more like a holistic view on the project and then make them comparable for investment committee. And then, of course, also following up on the project controlling, like the budget to actual performance of those investments, but also projects and execution. You said it, I mean, legislation is changing. If you remember back then, 2016, the European market basically was more or less collapsing. We had 5 gigawatt total installation in 2016. I mean, last year we had probably 60 gigawatt in Europe. 2016 it was 5. So this market basically then was still difficult, although only focusing on downstream business. Basically, the shareholder decided to slow down, wind down the operation in Europe. And that's why also the Conergy story came really to an end finally in 2016. And then there was another turn into Chint.
If you don't mind me just intersecting, at that point, do you think you knew you were then going to be stuck in renewables for the foreseeable future, or could it have still gone either way?
It's a very good question. I mean, in the early days, you always feel like, okay, this is an interesting job, but there's so much to discover and so much to see outside the world. And then you see those setbacks, those insolvencies, and you'll think like, okay, good, I can do something else. I'm still young. There's so many other things to do, so many other exciting industries. Actually, in 2016, it was really like the turning point to decide, okay, do I want to have a more secure job after more or less 10 years or working just in crisis industries? I mean, when I started in 2007, my career, there were stressful economic situation, right? And it was not a success journey, let's say, from a business environment until that date. Nevertheless, we always worked hard, and I think we did our best to compete. But it was an opportunity, and I always like to take the opportunity than to take, the prudent approach, or rather take the challenge than to take the safe way, always. But of course, the opportunity was there and had to be there. Otherwise, I might have ended up in another industry, indeed.
Back to the timeline, how did the opportunity with Chint come about?
Yeah, I mean, you saw this coming in Conergy then in 2016, and we were a team of 5-6 people, and then decided, hey, actually, it could be great to do business further in that industry because we know how it works, we know what to do. It was just not the right market at the point in time, but the market will be back. This is obvious. Solar will grow, and this will have a future. Yeah, we were looking around how we can set that up, and basically we found the opportunity to team up with Chint. Chint is a huge company, globally active, very well integrated in the solar industry, but also knowledgeable about business. And we got the opportunity to set up the European development business in 2016 with a small team. And the idea was at the beginning not to grow quick and discover the world, but more like focusing on very good projects in specific markets. And we started business in the Netherlands, which was back in the days the most attractive market, 2017, 18, 19, with the SDE tariffs back in the days. I mean, it's always like you described before, there's one market up, the other is down. And it's up back in the days, the Dutch market was just picking up like hell. And we were luckily at the right time in the right market. And so we grew quite quickly in the Dutch market with the small team. We kept it quite small in the beginning until, let's say, 2020, around about 21, 22. And now we grew to 130 people in the meantime, which is still efficient, but also considering we are not serving just the Netherlands, but now 8 different markets in Europe. And the business model was quite clear. We want to develop business, and then also realize the business. So we want to act as a project developer and EPC. So that's our core function. And so we started, and my responsibility then was, first of all, procurement and finance. So to set up the proper procurement strategies, finding the right partners to build up our projects, and on the other side, developing the financial environment, financial landscape from scratch, basically.
And what was the change like going into a developer, coming from the background that you had with Conergy and Qcells?
Yeah, Conergy was actually as well a developer,
Okay.
so especially after 2030. So, but of course, it could be different scale. I think that was different. So at Conergy, we were at the end of the day like 300 people. At 300 people, you find a lot of people who can support and have an expertise on something. If you are people of 5 or 6, you are really like, okay, there is not a responsibility for everything. So you need to do what has to be done at the end of the day, and someone needs to do the job. So I was seeing myself driving to the Netherlands, meeting municipalities or landowners or consultants, like really doing the bottom-up development business, which was really new for me back in the days where, I did risk management, which is more like the helicopter view.
Yeah. I mean, just naturally going into a company, you said there was only 5 people at Chint Europe when you started? Yeah. Going into that environment, you are going to have to do things outside of your core expertise. You probably get more exposure to the actual business side of things.
Yeah, I think I always like to think out of the box. So that was new to me, but it's more like you're forced to do, and you really can make a difference by doing it on a daily basis. So what's your limit is basically your own ambition in a startup, right? It's not limiting. Financial limitations are there, of course, but you can do a lot. There are a lot of opportunities, and it's more about how much resources I have to spend and to put on the right things. And at the end of the day, you need to bring all the things together to deliver projects, and that's what we did. In the first year, we realized the 50 megawatt project, still with a small dream, which was back in the days one of the largest projects in Europe, built in that year, right? So, and the year after, we realized the 100 megawatt project, which was amazing with a high voltage grid connection. And back in the days, we were like 10 people and sitting there with the tenant, with the huge TSO in the Netherlands, and explaining them how solar works, because they did not understand a PV plant. So we went there with like a catalog of questions and how to react if they ask this and that. And the initial question was, yeah, guys, can you explain us solar? And we were not prepared for that question, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I think you mentioned this briefly, but Chint's strategy at that time, was there a geographical focus about how you wanted to go into different countries, or did that kind of come as it was?
Yeah, I mean, it was clear that we will go with the markets at the end of the day. So we weren't saying like we are a Dutch company. We are Hamburg-based. It was always clear we will look into the European market wherever it develops, from a regulatory and economical point of view. So we did Netherlands first, but then we meant to move to Portugal, to Germany, to the UK, Italy, France, Spain, and Hungary. That were countries along that journey since back in the days, and we will still be open to look into new countries when we see opportunities. It's also not so easy to go into a new market. It's not happened by saying, but you need to really find the right people there. Time to market is of essence. So usually if everyone talks about the market, it's too late, right? So we were luckily the first in the Netherlands. We saw a lot of other companies coming. Most of them were just too late at the end. So that's a bit like the big challenge always in development business, if you act globally, to anticipate the trends and the markets at the right point in time. And of course, finding the right people.
Exactly, yeah. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Netherlands is probably a slight exception to the majority of countries in Europe, where you probably can get away a bit more with not having absolute local knowledge in place.
True.
Like most countries in Europe, you need local developers, you need local land acquirers, etc., to be able to communicate with municipalities. Yeah, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, on the Netherlands, I think it was different in the 2017-18. There was quite an openness for solar, right? It was a new technology. It was well accepted. Everyone was curious about that. But I mean, as it is in this industry, sometimes if it's growing quick, it attracts a lot of parties. Some also act not very reasonable. This of course, makes some noise in the market. At the end of the day, if you look to the Dutch market right now, primarily you see local developers. I mean, there are not internationals anymore. In the other countries, I think in the UK, it's also quite, of course, normal to go there. This was a market back in the days. It's now a market again. I think especially in Germany, it's quite difficult as a non-German to be there, not only because of language barrier, because people are not speaking that well English all across, but especially also it's very localized business, which is true actually for a lot of other countries as well. But there is a different openness to international people in the one or the other country, I would say.
It's a really interesting market. We support it in some of the countries you've mentioned as well, and I only do so with like local recruiters even, just to keep it completely local. Chint has obviously changed significantly in the 10 years that you've been there. And I also guess it's the first company in renewables that you haven't managed through some sort of insolvency as well. So how has that change been, and like what's it been to be part of that kind of expansion from, let's say, maybe a startup to a scale up?
Yeah, I think it's important thing is really to have a shareholder and a company who is financially strong and is loyal to the business and is knowing the business, right? So this gives a lot of support to us to grow the business. I think what's important for us is, of course, to react and go into the markets where we see potential. I mean, it also gives you some warning on long-term investments, you know, like you see markets turning quickly from boom market to bust markets, and then you really need to act also with your resources. And that's how we set up the business, by being quite flexible and quite diligent in how we invest money and where to put our focus, but always making sure we are moving also into new business models, into new ideas where we can generate profits and future business. So, I mean, this was also the idea around this innovation technology role I'm currently heading as well, you know, to not stuck into our traditional business of PV development, where we could already seen that the market is moving. There's new things coming up, like agrivoltaics, like battery storage, like hydrogen. And then to create a role exploring those opportunities was quite important. And that's a bit like how we, as a team, I mean, the core team is still around, defined our business in Europe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, without kind of giving too much away, how do you strategically, for example, make a, let's say, underperforming market work? Is it just simply looking at it from a helicopter view and seeing what other solutions you could offer, or?
Well, what means underperforming? I mean, at the end of the day, you cannot find the market. You cannot change the facts, right? If there is, the market is not attractive, you need to find certain exit strategies or investment strategies, how you maintain it. Nevertheless, the market will move in cycles, especially now. We're not relying anymore on subsidies. We are competing against other energy sources, and our biggest basically a threat to the industry is currently regulation. So it's limited grid, it's permitting, and it's general acceptance by politicians. I mean, that's basically the threat. But this could change quickly. It's not anymore about back in the day subsidies, and when they are gone, they never come back. So to answer your question, I mean, what helps us and what's our biggest strength is that we have quite extended value creation. So we are a developer, but we are also APC. So we can cut out margins in between, which we can utilize. And we can still adjust our product. So if we have a PV project as of today, which is maybe not the big, you know, cash cow anymore for a developer, you could still think about, I have grid connection as well. What can I do around? Is there a wind park I can team up? Is there an opportunity to build a battery alongside the PV for green BESS? Or is there actually a possibility to talk to the grid operator to get consumption capacity and build a standalone battery or a PV project with a BESS, including consumption from the grid, which is a completely different asset class immediately and has completely different business models. And you can think it further and further around grid connections. So what the idea currently is really thinking about what you can do in those markets we're active in, because we have the market insights, we know the DSO, the TSOs, and study the regulatory environment. Even if it's not attractive today, it might be in 2, 3, 5 years from now.
It's really interesting. And I guess now you are in the quite luxurious position of sitting with your, you know, finance procurement hat on, but having had over 15 years experience in the market and seen the market, you know, how it's gone up, how it's gone down, how it's changed. I guess you're in quite a luxurious position now for that.
Luxurious was not the expression I would choose, but indeed it gives you a great experience and a good background on how to assess things. But nevertheless, I mean, you need to decide as a team where to move forward. Certainly, especially procurement insight is very helpful sometimes to really read markets, to understand market dynamics, and to see also what customer and competitors are doing and suppliers are doing. But at the end of the day, in transforming market, it's about how you navigate, right? So how much risk you can take to do further business, where to invest and where maybe not to further invest. So that's the situation the whole industry is managing at the moment. But of course, it's not luxurious in the way of, you know, you can lean back and it's more the other way around. It's quite challenging and demanding to take decisions on a frequent basis.
Yeah, of course. And so you've already talked about this a little bit, but your current kind of position and role with Chint today, what sort of team do you look after? And you mentioned offline that you still travel quite a lot. So how does that look?
Well, I mean, I'm doing this procurement and finance since almost 10 years. So this year's the 10th year. So the teams is well set up over the period of time. I mean, that's the key focus here, taking a more strategic view on both how we further develop our finance, how my interaction is there, mostly involving in the transaction business on M&A side, being it sell or buy side of project rights or structuring agreements with developers, more commercial. On the procurement side, of course, we always need to look into new technologies, into new suppliers, especially on the battery energy storage side. The market is quite fragmented. So there we need to be at the state of the art if it comes to technology, but also on customer requirements at the end of the day and bank requirements. And then, of course, on this whole innovation technology where we really need to watch out what's the next big thing, what's the next topic which comes up after battery energy storage. I mean, this for us solar guys, it's new, but there are a lot of companies, still play battery companies. They are active in that market since 4 years when we were still living in the booming PV market, right? So we need to watch out what's next. There's a lot we think about grid connections, which could be a bottleneck also from supply chain, large-scale grid connections, high voltage there with good companies to help us to build large grid connections in the different markets. And there are a lot of markets which have a good potential in Europe at the moment where we expect to do significant business in the next years.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I am hosting these podcasts once a week and I never go through the conversation without this multi-utility approach and or grid connection coming up. You already mentioned 5 minutes ago or so that you have some quite innovative solutions for grid connections or there's ways around it, grid connectivity.
Well, what means innovative? I mean, we are developers. So as a developer, you need to be innovative. That's not the one product you sell to the market, especially not in those times. I mean, back in the days, it was quite easy. You have a feed-in tariff project, and it was clear there was a bank or investor investing into it. Nowadays, you need to also develop solutions, what the financial investors look like. It's more like, hey, guys, what are you interested in? Where do you want to invest? In which kind of asset class? And there is diversification certainly is important because the solar profile learned the last year that this is vulnerable when it comes to energy prices. There's a cannibalization happening, especially when revenue streams are not guaranteed. So what we see is combined grid connections with wind, with solar, with battery energy storage, potentially even consumers like data centers and EV charging. So I think we need to think it differently, not from the sales perspective, but rather looking like what are the challenges we might face in 5 years. And certainly one challenge is access to grid. Yeah. The good thing is we as a developer usually have good access to grid because we are developing projects and talking to the grid operators. And maybe solar is quicker than other technologies when it comes to deployment. So we might be more fast moving than other sources of energy generation. So this will not work for every market. So what's important is to find for every market the right setup because also energy markets are completely different across Europe. When you look for Germany, the Netherlands or Southern Europe, right? Also generation profiles are completely different.
Yeah, exactly. It differs completely case by case. In this case, grid connection is always a stopping topic. So in every single market is a topic in some way. But I guess the point is you approach it slightly differently. What about some like future predictions for the market? What maybe countries in Europe that are kind of up and coming that there's still a lot of untouched business in and how you see the market in the next 5 years?
Yeah, there are a few markets I would say I have good insight. I did not study in detail. I think currently UK is certainly an interesting market, also lagging a bit behind solar installations and had quite issues on the grid, which is now being resolved with the grid queue being more sorted out. I think UK is interesting still for more traditional business. In the long run, I think we need to look into Southern European markets when it comes to integrated grid solutions, especially for the generation of renewable energy, wind, solar, batteries. And then, in the long run, also this hydrogen topic is a big topic. I mean, there was a big boom 4 years ago, but it lost a bit traction, also because of lacking political support, but also complexity of supply chain. But if you see, I think one maybe hard prediction here, if you look in terms of deployment of solar, China will face similar issues about oversupply of solar than you might see at some point in time in Europe. But if in China you will see a huge deployment of hydrogen, this will drive down costs significantly for electrolyzers and make this industry potentially much more attractive. Still, you need to build supply chain there, you need to find solutions, but in the long run, we have a high dependency on still fossil fuels, which can be solved to some extent with hydrogen. So this is something I still would expect, and if that happens, then rather in Southern Europe, but that's not something for this year, next year. I think that's why we will be more on a constant transition from the traditional business model to intermediate business model, and then in the long run, there might be different ones. And
do you think that's a viable multi-utility approach as well? So you could have hydrogen running alongside solar?
I think you need to, right? At the end of the day, if you purely rely on solar, you really need to move with the markets. Then maybe rather move to Africa at the moment, where you can still do a lot of off-grid on solar and you have huge potentials. Within Europe, I actually heard a number in another podcast a while ago, which was saying 50% of the installed capacity of solar was installed in the last 3 to 4 years in Europe. So if just imagine with this amount of scale, that means there are so many people, so many developers and investors active in the market. You cannot scale this endless, right? So because it's already now that you realize you're cannibalizing your price. Solar capture price is really moving away from the energy price. And because of that, I think you need to be more creative than just deploying solar like we did in the past. But there might be other markets still attractive for solar. What I mentioned, Africa has a lot of blind spots, I would say. But for Europe, I think we need to think multi-utility indeed.
Interesting. You've mentioned Africa a few times there. I find the African potential, of course, staggering from a climate perspective, from a space perspective. Do Chint have any operations in Africa or any plans to?
No, actually not yet, I would say. But it's also difficult to go there, right? It's not like the stable political environment you have in Europe, where it's easy to move from one country to another. What means easy? It's already challenging. Let's call it that way, what you said before. You need to have local people. But in Africa, you have the matter, political environment, legal system is challenging. All the financial currency risks you might face there. So, but if there would be a strong, let's say, political will from international banks to support that, I think this solar would have amazing potential in Africa to contribute to social welfare.
I, of course, mentioned all of the upsides without mentioning the downside, so thanks for doing that. I would have thought that by now, maybe even one country or two countries would have potentially been on board or been able to collaborate in a way that they were a bit of an innovator, that at least gives the opportunity for other African countries to potentially look and say, oh, well, look, they did it, so let's follow.
It's not our focus, I would say, as in our group. I mean, there are other, but we know from companies active there, and of course, we are curious to see how they develop. And also within our group, of the Chint group, there are certainly initiatives to look into Africa as well, but it's not our focus. I mean, it's also learning from the past. You said what we learned from previous companies. It's also, really limit what you're good in and what you know what to do. So if you find the right person to go to a certain market or have the right contacts, then it's something certainly we could explore because of the potential, but not just by fantasy going into a market. Yeah, of course, as is with any business, you of course need the financial viability for it as well. And I think that's where there's, like a few of the topics you mentioned, there's potentially some question marks. Yes. Bernd, thanks very much. I think this is concluding a really interesting discussion. Thanks very much for being on. We will continue to monitor the growth and the journey that you're on with Chint. I will leave your social media and things on the links below. And yeah, thanks for being a guest. Thanks for making this stories public. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for that. Cheers. Bye bye. Cheers, bye.